The shocking truth behind Pontiac Band 421 Super Duty Engine. What if I told you there was a Pontiac engine so powerful that GM didn't just cancel it? They tried to erase it from history. In 2019, a collapsed barn in Ohio revealed a stunning discovery. A 1963 Pontiac Catalina with an untouched 421 Super Duty under the hood. But stamped onto the engine block were the words, "Property of GM, destroy." Why would GM order one of its most powerful engines to be wiped from existence? The 421 Super Duty wasn't just another V8. It was Pontiac's ultimate weapon in the horsepower wars. Built to dominate NASCAR, drag racing, and even Chevrolet, this engine sent shockwaves through GM's corporate structure. Pontiac was winning too many races, selling too many performance cars, and worst of all, it was making Chevy look slow. Some say Pontiac was even developing a 462 cubic inch version that could have beaten Chrysler's 426 Hemi before it hit production. But instead of letting Pontiac rise, GM pulled the plug. Secret memos, corporate backstabbing, and an industry-shaking decision buried the 421 SD forever. Or did it? What else did GM try to hide? Drop a comment, like, and subscribe to Muscle Car Masters, because this is just the beginning. The secret origins of the 421 Super Duty. By the early 1960s, Pontiac was no longer just an underdog. It was emerging as GM's biggest wild card. While Chevrolet remained the company's performance poster child, Pontiac's engineers were quietly building a monster that could shake up GM's entire power structure. This revolution was led by Bunky Knudsen, Pontiac's general manager, who had one goal: make Pontiac the most dominant racing brand in America. Knudsen wasn't alone. John DeLorean and Pete Estes were cooking up something radical, a factory-built, race-ready engine designed to obliterate the competition. What came out of this effort wasn't just another big V8, it was the birth of the Super Duty program. The 421 Super Duty was a game-changer. It featured a 4.09-inch bore and a 4.00-inch stroke, reinforced with a forged steel crankshaft, heavy-duty connecting rods, and an aluminum dual-quad intake manifold. The factory rating? 405 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. But those who tested it on private dynos knew the truth. This engine was secretly making closer to 460 horsepower. Pontiac wasn't just playing catch-up. They were building the next generation of racing technology. And here's where things get really interesting. There are rumors that Pontiac was secretly testing an experimental 462 cubic inch version, which could have beaten Chrysler's 426 Hemi to the punch by nearly 2 years. Internal documents suggest they were also experimenting with early fuel injection, something that wouldn't become mainstream in muscle cars for decades. One former Pontiac engineer later admitted, "We knew we were onto something special. The 421 Super Duty wasn't just a race engine. It was a blueprint for the future of Pontiac performance. If we had been allowed to keep going, Pontiac wouldn't have just competed with Chevy. We would have left them in the dust." Then came Daytona 1962. Fireball Roberts piloted a Pontiac 421 SD-powered Catalina to victory, humiliating Chevrolet on one of NASCAR's biggest stages. Meanwhile, Pontiac's lightweight Catalinas, equipped with aluminum body panels, were running the quarter mile in just 12.4 seconds at 115 miles per hour. These weren't modified builds, these were factory-built race cars. But success came at a cost. By the end of 1962, Pontiac's dominance had triggered a war inside GM. Pontiac's unstoppable rise. By 1962, Pontiac wasn't just competing, it was dominating. The 421 Super Duty wasn't just winning races, it was rewriting the playbook of American motorsports. Fireball Roberts secured victory at the Daytona 500, and Joe Weatherly clinched the Grand National Championship, proving that Pontiac's racing program was no fluke. It was a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, on the drag strip, Super Duty-powered Catalinas and Tempests were consistently setting records. But Pontiac's success wasn't just a problem for Chevrolet, it was a wake-up call for Ford. Behind the scenes, Ford had spies attending Pontiac test sessions, desperately trying to decode the secret behind the 421 SD's dominance. Some reports suggest that Ford engineers even acquired disassembled Pontiac engines for internal study, attempting to counter Pontiac's growing lead. In response, Ford rushed the development of its 427 FE engine, hoping to match the power of the 421 SD before it was too late. But in early tests, Ford's 427 struggled with reliability, while Pontiac's race-proven Super Duty continued to dominate. Meanwhile, Pontiac wasn't just beating Ford and Chevrolet, it was getting dangerously close to dethroning Chrysler before the Hemi era even began. Internal documents hint that Pontiac engineers were already developing a 462 cubic inch Super Duty variant, which could have arrived before Chrysler's 426 Hemi ever hit production. If that engine had made it to the racetrack, it might have been the first true Hemi killer, reshaping the landscape of the American muscle car wars forever. Back at General Motors, Chevrolet executives were growing restless. The 421 SD had humiliated the 409, and Pontiac's engineers showed no signs of slowing down. Sources suggest that in late 1962, Chevy's top executives lobbied GM leadership, warning that Pontiac's unchecked rise was a threat to Chevrolet's dominance inside the company. A former NASCAR official later revealed, "It was obvious Pontiac had something special. The 421 Super Duty had power, durability, and speed. Chevy hated that." There were whispers that GM wanted to shut it down before it became a bigger problem. Inside Pontiac's engineering department, the tension was rising. They had already seen GM sabotage Oldsmobile's performance ambitions, and now Pontiac was pushing the limits of what corporate leadership would allow. They had one last shot, but the walls were closing in fast. In early 1963, General Motors would make a decision that would alter the future of Pontiac and the muscle car wars forever. The GM Shutdown, a corporate cover-up? January 1963. Without warning, Pontiac's racing division was blindsided by a devastating order. No more factory-backed racing. No more Super Duty engines. No exceptions. The directive came straight from the highest levels of GM's corporate office, sending shockwaves through Pontiac's engineering and racing teams. But this wasn't just about ending a program. It was a calculated execution, a premeditated takedown of Pontiac's racing dominance. This wasn't about safety concerns or public scrutiny. This was about power. Pontiac's engineers had spent years developing what could have been the most dominant V8 of the muscle car era. Leaked documents suggest that Pontiac was on the verge of releasing a 462 cubic inch Super Duty V8, an engine rumored to be even more powerful than Chrysler's upcoming 426 Hemi. If Pontiac had unleashed this engine on NASCAR and the drag strip, it could have rewritten the history of American performance before the Hemi even had a chance to prove itself. But that never happened, because Chevy saw what was coming and pulled the plug before Pontiac could take its final shot. Behind the scenes, Chevrolet was pressuring GM leadership to shut Pontiac down before it became an even bigger threat. The numbers spoke for themselves. Pontiac was consistently outpacing Chevy's 409, dominating NASCAR, and humiliating Ford's rushed 427 FE engine. Ford had thrown everything it had at Pontiac, including spies at test sessions and desperate engineering overhauls, but it wasn't enough. Pontiac was winning on all fronts. And now, GM executives had a choice. Let Pontiac continue its rise and risk a full-blown corporate power shift, or kill the program before it was too late. Then came the order to destroy everything. Every remaining 421 Super Duty engine, every blueprint, every prototype. The program was wiped from existence as if it had never happened. Officially, it was part of GM's self-imposed anti-racing ban, a corporate policy designed to distance the company from motorsports due to rising insurance costs, government scrutiny, and public safety concerns. But Pontiac insiders knew better. Yet, despite GM's strict orders to erase the Super Duty from history, some engines mysteriously vanished before the inspectors arrived. Pontiac engineers, realizing this was the end of an era, may have worked behind the scenes to save pieces of their greatest achievement. A former Pontiac insider later revealed,
"The night before the GM shutdown, we got a call. If you want to save anything, now's your chance." By morning, several SD parts had vanished. To this day, no one knows where they went.
Rumors persist that some engines were smuggled out through Pontiac-affiliated dealerships, given to racers under the table, or even used in underground racing circuits. Some rare Super Duty blocks have resurfaced over the years, still stamped with "Property of GM, Destroy." Pontiac's secret revenge. General Motors thought it had won. The 1963 racing ban had forced Pontiac to dismantle its Super Duty program, erasing the 421 Super Duty from factory production, and with it, any immediate threat to Chevrolet's dominance. Pontiac was expected to fall back in line, leaving the high-performance market to Chevy's Corvette and Impala SS. But Pontiac's engineers had no intention of giving up that easily. Instead of admitting defeat, they found a loophole, one so ingenious it accidentally ignited the muscle car revolution. Behind the scenes, Pontiac engineers who had worked on the 421 Super Duty refused to let their knowledge go to waste. If GM wouldn't let them build race-ready engines for sanctioned competition, they'd bring that same power to the streets. The result was the 1964 Pontiac GTO, a car that looked like an ordinary Tempest, but was, in reality, a street-legal Super Duty in disguise. Instead of focusing on sanctioned racing, Pontiac would put raw performance directly into the hands of everyday drivers, sidestepping GM's restrictions and forcing Chevrolet into a game of catch-up. The magic was under the hood. The GTO's 389 cubic inch V8 wasn't just a repurposed big block. It carried Super Duty DNA. It featured an aggressive camshaft profile, high-flow cylinder heads, and a performance-tuned intake system, directly inspired by Pontiac's outlawed race engines. For those who opted for the tri-power carburetor setup, the 389 V8 cranked out 348 horsepower and 428 pound-feet of torque, numbers that rivaled GM's best factory race cars from just a year prior. In the right hands, the GTO ran the quarter mile in 13.8 seconds at 104 miles per hour, performance that humiliated GM's attempts to suppress Pontiac's racing heritage. But this wasn't just about horsepower, it was a marketing masterstroke. On paper, the GTO was simply an optional package for the Tempest, slipping past GM's ban on high-performance intermediates. By the time executives realized what had happened, the GTO had already hit the streets, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Pontiac expected to sell 5,000 units in 1964. Instead, they sold over 32,000. One muscle car historian later put it best.
Pontiac didn't just create the first muscle car, they outsmarted GM, turning a ban into a business plan.
Pontiac had rewritten the rules of performance, and in doing so, had changed automotive history forever. No longer was high horsepower reserved for the track. Now, it could be bought straight from a dealership. The muscle car wars had begun, and Pontiac had fired the first shot. The lost future. What if Pontiac had won? What if GM had never pulled the plug on Pontiac's Super Duty program? What if the 421 Super Duty had continued to evolve, unrestricted by corporate interference? The reality is, we may have never seen Pontiac's full potential, and that is one of the greatest what-ifs in muscle car history. Had Pontiac been allowed to push forward, some insiders believe they could have built a 460-plus cubic-inch Super Duty monster capable of taking on Chrysler's legendary 426 Hemi before it ever became the king of the drag strip. With Pontiac's expertise in weight reduction and efficient power delivery, could they have engineered a Hemi killer before Dodge and Plymouth had the chance to claim dominance? And what about factory-backed racing? Could Pontiac have led GM into a golden age of motorsports dominance instead of Chevrolet? Even more mysterious is what Pontiac's engineers were working on in secret. We know that in the early 1960s, Pontiac had begun experimenting with fuel injection technology, a concept that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. Were they developing an advanced racing fuel system that could have rewritten the rules of performance? Were there Super Duty prototypes that never saw the light of day, buried beneath layers of corporate bureaucracy? What lost Pontiac prototypes still remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The story of the Pontiac 21 Super Duty isn't just about the past. It's about what could have been. If GM hadn't shut it down, could Pontiac have been the true king of muscle cars? Could the 21 Super Duty have beaten Chrysler's Hemi and rewritten racing history? More importantly, how many other legendary engines and prototypes were erased before they could change the game? This isn't just about nostalgia. It's about digging deeper. Are there still lost Pontiac Super Duty engines hidden in barns, garages, or forgotten storage facilities? Have you ever seen a prototype that shouldn't exist? We want to hear your stories. We're not just telling history, we're uncovering it. Drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe to Muscle Car Masters to join the movement and bring the lost legends of American muscle back to life. The truth is out there. Are you ready to help find it?